All right, today's video is an important video, I think. At least it was very important for me because I'm really interested in knowing, because I want to know what I'm talking about, obviously. I talk about weapons, I review weapons, I give my impressions on weapons. It's probably an important thing for me to understand how much damage they do. Now, I've been sitting on this data for a little while now. I had almost all of it done. I finished out the last bits today. This took friggin' forever, guys, because in order to get these numbers, what I had to do was to solo queue into operations all of these damage numbers. I want to explain where I got these, right? It's all on the Ruthless tier, and all of the damage, I basically had to go in, and melee enemies and ranged enemies take damage differently, right? They have their own sort of innate modifiers. So I had to load up an operation, shoot one bullet, just one bullet at one isolated target. I had to make sure there was no splash damage, no overpenetration, and I could just hit the one target one time and then force myself to die, wipe, look at the damage numbers at the end screen after the operation failure, and then just do it all over again. And every single one of these numbers was also verified multiple times. So I'd do it like at least 2 times. I would do this, sometimes more if I had questions or if I was unsure about something. So all of this has been double checked as well. So we've got damage for every single gun against melee Majoris enemies and against ranged Majoris enemies. And that's how this graph is broken down for you. And I've put it all together for you in a graphic. If you wanted to screenshot this, you wanted to save it onto your desktop and pull it up, and you want to have it handy for when you have conversations or arguments with people on Reddit threads, I don't care. Use this as you see fit. And if you want to say, hey, I got it from True Vanguard, that's fine too. If you don't, whatever. Okay, let's go down this list and we'll talk about these numbers. I want to break these numbers down. So first we'll just go over them, and then I want to talk about what does that actually mean. And another thing that's important to note is that damage is not the only variable, right? So this is just the damage that it does. This is not what we call DPS. You might hear the term DPS in gaming. That's damage per second. So something could do 150 damage, but it might be able to do that damage once a minute, right? And you could have something that does 4 damage, but it does that 4 damage every second. It's 4 damage per second. So if you go for the full minute, what gun's doing more damage? The 4 damage or the 150? It's the 4. So these damage numbers aren't the be-all, end-all. They're just another variable in the equation. But it's important to get these out here. And another thing that's important to know about these numbers, so these numbers were taken from the relic tier of all of these guns, and with the standard firepower. So if there's like one version that has one more firepower than all the others, it's not that one. It's the one that is the most uniform, okay? So relic tier, ruthless, standard firepower, okay? And there are obviously lots of other variables, like within your build or within the perk tree of the gun itself, you could get like an extra 10% here and there. So I tried to make sure that all of those were off of the table. If I missed something, please let me know. I want to have the most accurate information possible. But once you start adding in these like 10% modifiers, you're going to see like small changes in fractions of percentages of your damage. So something does 7 damage, and you're adding 0.7 damage onto it. So now it's 7.7. You know what I mean? So you might get a little bit of difference in your mileage based on those other perks you have on. But anyways, let's go over this. That's enough talk. But I wanted to make sure you knew how I got to these numbers and what they mean, okay? So, Instigator bolt rifles first up. This one's interesting because one of the things you'll notice is that the damage to melee enemies and the damage to ranged enemies, it's not like a uniform equation where, oh, we always just multiply it by 1.5 and that's what you get against ranged enemies. It's not that simple. So every weapon has its own innate modifiers, I have found. Because I fell into the trap of thinking, well, if I just test one weapon on both, I'll find out the modifier between melee and ranged, and it'll be uniform across the board. It's not, right? So, Instigator bolt rifle does 22 damage to the head against melee Majoris enemies. It's not to the body. I didn't measure the melee or the body shot damage on these. These are all assuming you're aiming for the head, right? We're looking at maximum damage output. 22 damage for a full burst of the Instigator bolt rifle. That's the 3-round burst. Bop, bop, bop. It's on the Vanguard class. But then against ranged Majoris enemies, it does 43 damage, which is actually, you'll find in the other numbers here, that's a really big jump. That's basically double damage against a ranged enemy, and most weapons don't get 2 times the damage against range. So the Instigator bolt rifle, that's why it's important to look at these individually, because it's going to help you know how to best use your gun. So if you're using the Instigator, and you see a melee Majoris enemy, use the chainsword. Okay, use the chainsword. Save your ammo for the ranged Majoris enemies. It's going to chew them to pieces. Great gun for that. But you're a Vanguard, so use your grapple, fly into the melee guys, kick them in the face, and then start hitting them with a chainsword and take them down easy peasy. And then use the instigator for the ranged guys. Then we have the Melta rifle. I want to circle back. We'll talk about the Meltas because I always get people who criticize my thoughts that Melta is A tier, top of A tier, but not quite S tier. There's a reason for that. It wasn't just because I don't like Melta. I love using the Melta. It's super easy to use. But when we talk about the ceilings, okay, the ceilings are higher on other guns, and you'll see that here. So, Melta rifle, 29 damage to melee Majoris enemies, 58 damage to ranged Majoris enemies, okay? Stalker Bolt. The Stalker Bolt does 39 damage. This is the semi-automatic. It's sort of like a precision marksman's rifle. It is on the sniper class. It's also on the tactical class. It's going to do 39 damage to the head against melee Majoris enemies and 58 damage to the head against ranged Majoris enemies. Notice, that's the same damage as a Melta rifle, but more ammo, faster rate of fire, and you can take these guys out from across the map. You don't have to go all the way over to them like you do with the Melta rifle. The Melta rifle, if the guy's on the edges of the map with a sniper rifle beaming you, and that thing sucks to get hit by the way, you know that as well as I do. When you have the Stalker Bolt, you just look at them from across the map and boom, 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 there you go. But with the Melta rifle, you're going to have to go all the way over through the mobs, clear a path, and get over to them to hit them with that same amount of damage. That's why I actually prefer the Stalker Bolt over the Melta rifle on tactical myself. Moving on to the Heavy Bolt. We have 7 damage to melee Majoris enemies, 11 damage to ranged Majoris enemies. That's per bullet. Obviously, this is a fully automatic weapon, so if you're looking at the other numbers we just went over and you're like, holy cow, that's so little. It's not really so little because it's a fully automatic weapon. It has a big magazine, so you're just going to be holding down the trigger. So it's that's respectable, okay? That's respectable damage. Then you have the Auto Bolt, which has 5 damage to melee Majoris enemies and 7 to ranged Majoris enemies. Has a faster rate of fire and a faster reload speed than the Heavy Bolt. So it has it actually has a higher DPS value in terms of damage per second that it can do than the Heavy Bolt. But a lot of people prefer the Heavy Bolt just for the chunk damage in shorter spurts. But over time, the Auto Bolt is going to do better against bigger trash mobs. Bolt Rifle is next. The Bolt Rifle, this is the one that has the underbarrel grenade launcher. It's that gun, okay? 11 damage to melee Majoris enemies and 17 to ranged Majoris enemies. This is where words can be misleading. You might think, well, you have a Bolt Rifle and then you have a Heavy Bolt Rifle. Obviously, the Heavy Bolt Rifle is going to do more damage, right? Wrong. No, so the Bolt Rifle is doing considerably more damage here to both melee and range. 17 on range as opposed to 11 from the Heavy Bolt. 11 to melee Majoris enemies as opposed to 7 with the Heavy Bolt. Considerably more damage output. That's why this gun is just better. Okay, it's why it is at the it's a very tippy top of A tier for me, and a lot of people say S tier, and I don't argue with them. I think that's a very fair thing to put it in the S tier. Especially when you start thinking about the bottom line of its graph, the auxiliary grenade launchers. So I don't think those people are necessarily wrong. We just grade things a little differently. So, yeah, Bolt Rifle is just better than the other Bolt Rifle options on Tactical. Moving on to the Oculus Bolt. This gun is trash. Does 5 to the head against melee Majoris enemies, 7 to the head against ranged Majoris enemies. Except it is less accurate than the Auto Bolt. It reloads slower. So it's just not good. If you don't like the Auto Bolt Rifle, then you're going to hate the Oculus Bolt Rifle. The Oculus is on the Vanguard class specifically. It's dog crap, and I don't think you should use it. If you want to use it because you like it, great. Don't let me tell you otherwise. The most important factor in playing a video game is to have fun. If you have fun with it, then use it. Far be it from me to tell you how to play your video game. I just think it's trash. Then we have the Bolt Carbine SMG. This one's really interesting. This split here is wild, okay? This is the biggest change from melee to ranged enemy damage output. So the Bolt Carbine SMG does 2 to the head against a melee Majoris enemies. It does 8 to the head against a ranged Majoris enemies. This is the fast rate of fire version of the gun. So I need to go back in and I'll test. Eventually I'll test all the versions. I know a lot of people are like, well, what about the precision version of it? Listen, I didn't do that one yet, so I'll have to get around to it. But the fast rate of fire 2 damage to the head against melee Majoris enemies. In other words, don't use it. It's a waste of ammunition against those guys. Use your melee weapon against melee Majoris enemies. But against trash mobs, gaunts, Zangors, and ranged Majoris enemies, it actually has very good damage against those guys. More than the auto bolt, more than the Oculus bolt, and a way faster rate of fire, meaning the DPS against big ranged guys is very respectable on this thing. Moving on to the Bolt Sniper, we're going to do 76 to the head against melee Majoris enemies. This is now the highest that we've seen so far, followed by 113 damage to ranged Majoris enemies. That's a lot of damage. I really like the Bolt Sniper. I think it's not better. I don't think it's better than the Las Fusel, to be clear. I said that in my weapons tier list, but I just prefer using it. I think it's a fun gun to use. Next up, we do have the Las Fusel, which is going to do, and you're going to see this. This is insane. 131 to the head against melee Majoris enemies. That is a lot of damage. It's also going to do 196. 196 to ranged Majoris enemies. That is some serious big boy DiMaggio right there. That's why the Las Fusel is the king when it comes to the sniper class. Moving on to the Plasma Incinerator. This is only on the tactical. It does, this is something, let me just say this up front. This is something you'll see with 2 out of 3 of the plasma weapons, is that the standard shots are very weak, while the charged shots are very strong. That's true for 2 out of 3. The Plasma Incinerator on the tactical class, it's going to do 6 to, well, it doesn't really do headshot damage. You might get the like double lines that makes you think you're doing headshot damage. It's actually the same. I tested it both to the body and to the head. It's going to do 6 damage to melee Majoris enemies. A fully charged up Plasma Incinerator shot will do 64 damage, though, which is actually very respectable in this category. Against ranged Majoris enemies, it's going to do 8 damage per shot, 96 for your charged shots. If I could say one thing, it would be that I don't think it's worth using standard shots against Majoris enemies with the Plasma Incinerator. I think the standard shots should be reserved for your Minoris enemies, but your Majoris enemies, you're going to want to use the charged shots on these because in terms of like ammo, economy, and damage ratios, you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck. So highly recommend that. Heavy bolt pistol. So we're talking about the secondary weapons now. The heavy bolt pistol, very respectable here. 19 damage to the head against melee Majoris enemies, 28 to the head against ranged Majoris enemies. It shoots slower, so it makes sense it's going to do bigger damage, but that's actually pretty respectable damage output if you're an assault main. This is why I only run the heavy bolt pistol on my assault class, and most other people do. It's just way better than the alternatives. The standard bolt pistol is going to do 9 to the head against melee Majoris enemies and 14 to the head against ranged Majoris enemies. Again, pretty respectable for a sidearm. Plasma pistol, this is going to reflect what I said earlier, where they do pretty weak damage with their standard shots. It's only going to be 4 damage against melee Majoris enemies, but a fully charged up shot is going to be 53 damage. So you're going to do, in the same amount of ammo with a charged shot, you're going to do considerably more damage than if you were to use that same amount of ammo just shooting individual bullets. Always charge it up against Majoris enemies. And same thing's true for the ranged. You're going to do 7 per shot or 79 if it's charged up, which is obviously way better. So definitely charge it up against Majoris enemies. Next up, we have the heavy bolter on the heavy class, which is a super fun weapon. I love using this gun. It looks bad on paper, but there's a couple things to note here. First, against melee Majoris enemies, it's only going to do 6 damage to the head. But against ranged Majoris enemies, the multiplier is much greater. We're going to do 18 damage against ranged Majoris enemies. That's a pretty big jump up. You know, a lot of times you're looking at 1.5, like 1.5 damage modifier from melee to ranged. But here we have a 3x modifier, which is very, very good. So this thing's going to chew up ranged majors on the field. If you're up close with a melee Majoris enemy, you may want to rely on like parries and gun strikes instead of using the heavy bolter. But against the ranged guys, that's where it's really going to shine. Another thing to note is that obviously once you spin this thing up, your DPS is going to be insane. It's going to be insane. That's why it's really, really fun. So if you're just shooting one bullet at a time, it's not going to get you very far. Spin it up, you're going to chew them up. Next, we have what I believe to be the best weapon in the game. It's the best weapon in the game. Heavy Plasma Incinerator. Okay, this is going to do. This is the one that breaks the mold for what I said with the the plasma weapons. I said the standard shots were not very good damage, while the charge shots were. This one gets both. Both are great. So a heavy plasma incinerator is going to do 40 damage against melee Majoris enemies and 180 damage if you charge it up. There's two things to note here. First, the uncharged shot from a heavy plasma incinerator is more damage than a standard melta rifle can do. And that's one of the things that people always say. They're like, no. When I say melta's A tier, they're like, no. It does great single target damage. Listen, it doesn't. It does very respectable single target damage, but it does not do great single target damage. An uncharged heavy plasma incinerator, just one shot, bink, more damage than a melta rifle can do. Okay, that is pretty wild. It's also more than a stalker bolt, which is pretty cool too. But 180 damage if you charge it up against these guys is the most damage one thing can do, period, to a melee Majoris enemy. And note as well that that's going to do splash damage to everything around it too. That 180 damage is going to be shared by anything that's in the splash zone. So if you get a mob of majors and you fully charge it up and you let that baby rip, you are nuking that crowd, okay? There's not a single other thing in the game that can do that much damage to a melee Majoris enemy, period. That's why it's the best gun in the game. And the same thing rings true for ranged Majoris enemies. It's going to do 60 damage with an uncharged shot. An uncharged shot's going to do 60 damage. That's more than a melta rifle, more than a stalker bolt, more than an instigator. It's very, very good, just for considering how quickly you can shoot that much damage. But then here's the other thing. The charge damage with 0 buffs is going to be 269 damage. You can easily get that higher, by the way. Very easily make that higher. But just no buffs, 269 damage is going to absolutely nuke. And again, same thing. There's no other thing in the game that can do that much damage to a ranged Majoris enemy, period. No other weapon can do that much damage. Wild. Now we have a very interesting gun here. You're going to notice something right off the rip with the multi-melta. The two damage numbers are the same. The multi-melta doesn't have a modifier, apparently, between ranged enemies and melee enemies. It's just going to be very consistent. That's why it is an incredibly good gun. Multi-melta is going to do 56 damage to melee Majoris, 56 damage to ranged Majoris. Here's what's weird about that, is if you look at the heavy plasma incinerator, just the standard shot does 40, which is less than what a multi-melta is going to do to a melee Majoris. Obviously, the charged shot changes that equation dramatically. It absolutely tucks the multi-melta into bed with a warm glass of milk. But just the standard shot's going to do less. But the standard shot for the heavy plasma is going to do more damage than a multi-melta to ranged Majoris enemies. So it's a really interesting sort of relationship here. The multi-melta is just consistently very good damage, but other things can surpass it very consistently too. And the other thing you have to remember about the multi-melta that makes it so good is that the range on it is really, really good too. Like you can catch a lot of things in that one trigger pull. So it's just something you have to keep in mind. And then last but not least, we have the auxiliary grenade launchers. This is the underbarreled grenade launcher that is attached to the bolt rifle. And we already established the bolt rifle is really, really good, right, in terms of its damage output. But then you start thinking about the underbarrel grenade launcher, things are even better here, because you're going to do, and again, you're going to know the same thing with the multi-melta. It doesn't have a modifier. 110 damage to melee Majoris enemies and 110 damage to ranged Majoris enemies. So, very, very good in both categories. And obviously, if you are using this thing, you're probably using Emperor's Vengeance, which means you're going to fully replenish your grenades anyways whenever you kill a Majoris enemy. So that's really cool. That's why this gun is so freaking good. So freaking good. So anyways, that is the whole list. And let me know if you learned something new going over these things. I will tell you, I think this just confirmed what I already believed to be true about the heavy plasma incinerator. It's just got the highest ceiling. It really has the highest ceiling. It's insane. It also confirmed what I believed about Las Fusel being an S-tier weapon. Those damage numbers are insane, and the fact that you can basically have infinite ammo with the Las Fusel is wild too. So Those two weapons really rise to the top, as well as the bolt rifle. I think those are the three best weapons in the game, are Heavy Plasma Incinerator, Las Fusel, and the bolt rifle, followed by Multi-Melta after that. But that would be my like hierarchy of weapons. And this, I think, goes to show why I believe that. And you're definitely totally allowed to look at other variables and say, well, I disagree because the rate of fire or the reload speed on this thing or the range on this thing or the way that does damage in actual combat is a little different than this. Those are all totally fine. I just wanted to explain why I believe what I believe and why I think what I think. So there you go. Copy this, screenshot it, use it. I don't care, but hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you learned something. And if you did, leave a like on the videos. That's the best free way to support the content right here on YouTube. And feel free to subscribe for additional Space Marine content. And I look forward to catching you in the next one. Bye-bye.